Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
All right, broadcast from later. We're exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal of change is something we notice. It's an event, an idea, an issue that we don't fully understand yet, but we suspect it might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. From later, we're steady soaking up and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on these broadcasts, we're just giving a glimpse of what it looks like when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about. Basically, it's structured like show and tell. A few of us each bring in a signal. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. Collectively, we're trying to make sense of it, speculate on where it might lead. If you're listening and you feel lost and you don't understand what we're talking about, it's no problem. Neither do we. It's literally the newest stuff we know about. If you're listening and you like it and you think this is a good idea to practice this practice, I encourage you to formalize something like it for yourself or informalize. Also, let us know. Like, subscribe, comment. Get at me however you might. I don't know anything. Everybody's just trying to figure it out as we go. Today on the Vroom call, we have myself, Robert Bolton, our producer, Jeremy Glenn. Returning to broadcast is Jayar LaFontaine, who we've been working with lately on top secret stuff at Lodic AI. Welcome, Jayar. Welcome back.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here.
Valdis is here, and Julian Bleecker, an artist, an engineer, strategist, and a living legend, a future Hall of Famer in this field of speculative futures. Is that okay to say?
Yeah, I'll accept that with grace and humility.
It's important, I think. I wanted to give you your flowers, and
I appreciate that. It's very generous of you.
You've done much for the discipline and literally wrote the manual. So it's true that From Later would not exist the way it does if it weren't for groundwork laid by yourself and Near Future Laboratory.
Thank you.
We've had the chance to chat a couple of times just recently. And in general, I really like how you move professionally, that you very earnestly are trying to build community around not just the discipline, the design fiction, TM discipline, or, but all of these sort of futures work that various people are doing in a way that's very, no nonsense, open, non-competitive. And I wanted to ask, so what are you trying to do? What's the project all about at the moment?
There's a project going on. I'm really feeling it. And for a number of years, in and around Near Future Laboratory, I don't think I was sure exactly what was going on. And I was rolling very much with a sense of slightly panicked instinct. And so but the way I look at what's going on, I sort of refer to it as the third evolution of the Near Future Laboratory. Kind of started out originally as my blog. This is back in 2005, 2006 when I was teaching at USC, and I was teaching film students interactive media. No one says interactive media anymore, but it was a thing. So it was a blog. It was just like a platform, a way to articulate ideas and sort of share my projects, and very humble little. It was a blog. And then there was the second evolution of Near Future Laboratory, which I think of as like the dad band phase. Where it was 4 or 5 of us who, every so often got together in my garage. We put the garage door up. Sometimes we actually played instruments. Sometimes we just sat around the sofa and drank beers. Metaphorically, sometimes we do a project, sometimes not. And every once and again, it was usually me who'd be like, "Hey, we can play at Joe's Pub for the Wednesday afternoon lunch crowd. You guys want to do that?" And we go down there and we play metaphorically, do a little, a thing, a project or that kind of thing. And that went on for like a long time. And to be honest, it's like, I never really felt like that was where I wanted to be. By that I meant, it felt like, as you would be if you were like enthusiastic about your dad band, like we should be playing like Giant Stadium. We should be playing Madison Square Garden kind of thing. And it's kind of a little bit of a cartoon image of the typical earnest band. There's usually one person who's super charismatic about what the band's doing. And the rest of the band is maybe, the complexity, the beautiful complexities of life. It's like, the drummer's starting a family. You're kind of like, well, okay, how's that going to fold into the project to actually get to Madison Square Garden or play Glastonbury or whatever. And, these kind of, I wouldn't even call it tension, but just like differences of purpose and where we want to get to happen. And then, the front man manages to, someone says like, hey, I think it's you. I think you should
Right.
set out on your own and either start your own, a different band or a different project or that kind of thing. And I feel like that was there was no tension. It was just like a graceful transition to like, actually, that's where the energy is.
Right.
And not saying that there's not energy amongst the other members of the band, but the drummer's going to start a family, and the guy who plays the jazz flute is going to do something entirely different, and maybe there is a little bit of a tension between the jazz flute guy and the front man who wants to play hardcore, and so they just go their different ways. You look at these histories, and so that's like the third evolution, and the way that so I'm the front man in that story.
Right.
With humility.
Okay.
And the way I want, or the one who just has I've got bigger ideas, and I need to find the way to kind of enact those. Otherwise I'll just be sad and feel like at some point like I should have actually taken that gig and played Glastonbury, even though maybe I didn't have a full set list. We'll figure it out. It's gonna be beautiful. Something great will happen. And then you go to Glastonbury and it's like there's another musician there who's who you admire, who's like, I'll play drums for you. Hell yeah, let's do this thing. And then there's another person who like plays sax. It's like, hey, can I fit into this? I think we can pull something together.
Mm-hmm.
And something happens in that moment. And I started getting those feelings like when during the pandemic, when there wasn't a lot of time and people couldn't, it was just crazy, right? And so I just started doing things. I started playing more. So I started a podcast. I decided to like try a new instrumentation. So start General Seminar.
Right.
I decided to, say, I wonder what it would be like if we hooked up this Marshall amp to this, this reverb system, and then that becomes like the Discord. And I just started feeling a lot of this energy, and the response from people was like, there was enthusiasm. Like, yeah, I've been looking for, this kind of tune. I feel it resonates with me. And so the community starts thriving and starts building and growing. And that is, to continue the music metaphor, it kind of stretches a little bit far, but I tell people it's like, I'm building an empire for the defense of the creative consciousness. And we need a festival, big scale. We need Coachella scale vibes around this.
Right.
Because it feels like it's something that is meant to be epic. And I think the idea of, or kind of framing it around, how can we reinvigorate the potential that all humans have to imagine expansively and to bring creativity into the mix in a way that I feel like it hasn't been for some time, and use that as a basis for evolving and developing, what we're referring to as like the practice, whatever it is, design, fiction, speculative design, or whatever. I think those are just kind of like markers within that. They're almost like music genres.
Right.
But we're going to do a festival, right? There are going to be lots of music genres there.
Right.
There's going to be the side stage where it's going to be, maybe it's a little bit more experimental, or maybe it's like Rihanna jamming with someone else who you wouldn't expect to be there.
Right.
Like just because they're like, we're here to create a vibe, and we're not going to single ourselves out as like the cornerstone of that. Where if this isn't about trying to allow someone who's exceptionally prideful to show off, this is all of us together. And I felt that kind of vibe was something that was difficult to do when you're just, a dad band playing in a garage,
right?
And just cracking beers and cracking jokes.
Well, I think it's difficult, period. So that's what's so impressive, I think, about what you're doing and the energy around it right now is that, and that I think none of us involved, those of us who are involved at all, should take lightly, is that you clearly have a lot of energy for it, and are putting a lot of effort into this thing. And as much as you have this like sense of humility about all of it, but like the actual efforts that are going into organizing these things, it's significant, no?
Yeah, it's a load, and part of that is why I think trying to draw people into it and find the there's that first tier of people who are like, I love this, I love the feeling that I'm getting from whatever this thing is. I guess there's me, and then there are people kind of like, whatever you need, and they just have that an equal amount of energy and enthusiasm, and they might not be at the tip of the spear, but they're part of the vanguard in a way. They're doing it anyway, and they're just kind of in some way maybe subtly we're waiting for someone to come along and say, hey, over here, this is where we're going to set up camp,
right?
And look, can you see that? Like this is where the stage is going to go, and they're like, okay, cool, yeah, let's do this, and then they start building the stage,
right?
Whatever. The metaphor is starting to fall apart.
Yeah, I think it holds up well, and I mean, I think the the part that you went over quickly is just the creation of a scene, and that's what I think. There's like this moment that's maybe pre-festival that is like, yeah, the development of a scene when these things just happen, and it's with any genre of music in a given city. You know the feeling when you're in one, and whether you're playing like in a band or whatever it is, it's like, okay, it's something's coalescing. The energy feels real. People seem to care. Everybody's supporting one another and showing up to each other's events. And
Right.
there's so much timing and stuff that has to go into those things. And again, so much effort. I love the band. I mean, I've also played in bands as Jayar, and I mean, we've all been around that stuff, and I love that metaphor because it also, if you've done it, if you've lugged around gear, and
Yeah.
I also was a vocalist, so I was just helping out with the gear or carrying the guitar to look cool at the time. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's work that goes into those things, and time, and that's showing up for the sound check and at 4 PM and
That's
killing
right.
time till 1 AM
That's
before you
right.
go on.
My brother played in a touring band. I mean, he still does. And so there were some times when I went on tour, and then, way back in the day, I helped manage his band, which basically meant I kept a fistful of quarters in my pocket and would go to a payphone and call up venues and say like, hey,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
The other thing I related to is showing up to each other's gigs.
Mm.
That was something that would always go on. And you knew the people who were committed to helping each other grow because they showed up at each other's gigs.
Right.
Religiously, like it, and it was, it was all good vibes. And it didn't matter whether or not, I don't know, if there was any inkling in your mind, it's like, well, I don't really like the music these guys play. It didn't matter. You showed up anyway.
Right.
You didn't allow quibbling kind of to interfere, although of course it does because it's a creative practice. But in the best of worlds, you want to, my keywords nowadays are amplify, coordinate, and collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
And as a way of thinking about making decisions about what you're going to do, who you're going to share, or what you're going to shout out about. And I find it a little bit bewildering. I understand it, but I don't agree with it. I find it bewildering why that doesn't happen more zealously. Like, let's get our shit together. Like, we're all trying to do something to help people imagine more thoroughly, what humans can do as a creative species.
Right.
And so anything, feels like you should just be like, I'm just going to shout this out. Why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
What, and especially because it's so easy nowadays,
And that one is so important. It also depends, I think, on that sweet spot of something feeling like a scene, having that energy. But it's a little different. You're talking to 3 Canadians here, so we have a slightly different view around it. But when you're in that scene that feels like it's coalescing, when it feels like it's in its state of becoming, there is more pride in promotion. Self-promotion and the promotion of others doesn't feel so cringe as it sometimes can, and that's where I'm like, oh, maybe this is just a Canadian thing. But
sorry, can you clarify what's the Canadian thing?
Just not wanting to self-promote.
Okay, so
don't worry about that part. Let's stick to
I think it's important to nudge into it because I think there's a way of I get it, and I think that is a symptom of kind of beautiful state of mind, which is I don't want to be seen as kind of commercial, or the advertising is bad, all those kinds of things. So maybe, but then we've lost.
Yeah.
If you can't move beyond that and say but this is a beautiful thing. This is an individual. This isn't Procter and Gamble. This is an individual who's done something which is truly remarkable. They've translated something that they felt in their heart or imagined, and they're representing it to the world, whether it's music, for example. So I get why, I get that cringe, I don't want to seem to be self-promoting, but it's you made something. If you can't be proud of it to the degree where you can be I just want to let you know that I did something. I'm sure there's a boundary, but I think probably because we're allergic to doing it, that's probably a signal. It's we're very well adjusted. We are not being self-promotional in the kind of cringe influencer kind of way.
Yeah.
So that, to me, that's okay, well, stop it, get over it. No, this is cool. It's good.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, but I have to remind myself constantly of these types of things. I agree that it's the right thing to do. There's a great clip of Tyler, the Creator, talking about just artists who make a song and it goes on streaming platforms and they post it once on their Instagram and never show it again. And he's like, if that's your art, if that's your thing, you need to be like putting that, like posting that again every day, every day, until, keep shouting about it, keep telling everybody to listen to your song.
This is the the Amplify coordinate
Yeah.
collaborate the Amplify part. It's like it goes first, and I guess it's important to keep saying, not posting something particular, but keep saying this is how we're going to achieve the kind of level of beautiful greatness that we hope for. Is we need to amplify and amplify each other as well. You know what I mean? Like,
Definitely.
it's trying to create a mechanism. And I really don't want to get political, but there are other people who do it really, really well. And that's why it might feel like they're winning.
Yeah.
Message discipline. Message discipline.
The message has been Imagine Harder. Where did that one come from?
It was a podcast that I did, and I think it was around Extinction Rebellion. I was looking at Extinction Rebellion, and they were doing their kind of very kinetic interventions, throwing a wrench in the works. Stopping. I think it was like the Tube in London was a big one, and there was a panel of some sort that Metal Label organized, and some representative from Extinction Rebellion was going to present at this. And in this panel, they were doing their thing. They were just saying, like, we need to go after all the industries that are causing environmental collapse, et cetera. You get the thing. And I felt them. I felt I get it. Yes. And you feel that kind of level of desperate commitment that you do want to throw a wrench in the works. And I felt like, coming from a kind of speculative design fiction kind of sensibility, my mind immediately went to, what's it like the day after? If you guys, what's the plan? Like, if you're gonna blow up the bridge or whatever, now what have you done, and what are you gonna do the day after, when people are like, I need to get to the other side of that bridge? Or wait, so after we've averted climate catastrophe, what's for breakfast the next morning after the event or the moment?
Right.
And so just sort of thinking, like, you got to imagine harder.
Right.
You got to think through this stuff.
That's great.
And so that energy that goes into that idea of, like, we need to change and fix things, I love it. And I think it needs to be just pushed a little bit further. So can I have coffee the next morning? Oh, I can't. What's up with that? Well, we're not air freighting beans from Honduras to London. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Like, let's actually have a plan. And so that was a way of kind of representing that. And in the introduction of a book by a historian named Frederick Jameson, the book was called Seeds of Time, and it's basically a collection of lectures that he'd given. And in the introduction, he said, it seems easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So that was a phrase.
Right.
And that's been kind of worked around in various ways as a, potentially it's like a kind of thing that can be activating, be like, oh yeah, you're right. Like, I don't know what's on the other side of this kind of political economic system that we live in. It's hard for me to imagine what it is. And so it's almost like the way he phrases it in the introduction, it's kind of like, yeah, you're right. And there's not a direct response.
Right.
There's 120 pages of wonderful lecture, not lecture in a kind of like finger wagging way, but just like beautiful kind of like exposition and thinking through and reflecting and that kind of stuff. I mean, he's a wonderful historian. I think he's still alive. Not sure, might have passed. And then I was taken up by a philosopher named Mark Fisher, who essentially wrote an entire book built around this theme. And then Slavoj Žižek also, it's a recurring theme in his work. And there's competing kind of arguments as to who said it first and why they said it. Doesn't matter.
Right.
And the thing that does matter is like, well, we've got this existentially unique, potentially unique capability, because we've got this remarkable vascularized piece of meat in our heads that allows us to imagine the world. Otherwise, we do it all the time. Whether it's a kind of naturally occurring dreaming, or just daydreaming, or our mind wandering, I wonder what, for the most pedestrian kinds of things, to take your psychoactive of choice that allows you to kind of like look outside of yourself and wonder how things might be rearranged in the world. And then, of course, we've got science fiction, which is essentially its remit is to imagine the world otherwise and reflect back, present state in a slightly adjacent context, and in your literature generally, like fiction itself, is
Yeah.
imagining the world otherwise. So we have this ability to do that, and we exercise it in a variety of ways that it just sort of described. I think it's time that we remind ourselves that we do have this capability.
Right. Well, I'm glad I asked that about Imagine Harder. That was greater explanation than I would have assumed. Actually, I like it because of the pith. It just hits, and
Well, that's also it works. I mean, I think
it's got the think different apple, or like got milk, both with like the sort of off grammar, concise sort of pith, and yeah, it lands, it hits, and I appreciate that. So yeah, let's get into that. Let's imagine harder. Valdis, what's your weakest signal?
You know how like in the 90s, cars from Korea were like considered not that great, and then eventually in the 2000s, the manufacturing processes, they figured it out and they moved up the value chain. And now like a Kia is like one of the best like low cost cars you can get, and Hyundais are really great, et cetera, et cetera. North Korea kind of did this with hacking in the last like 10, 15 years,
Yeah.
where when they started out, they were kind of scrappy and whatever, using basic, simple, like social engineering hacks and stuff like that. And they kind of climbed up the value chain of hacking, as far as I understand. And now in the last 5 years, they struck gold, which was basically they started figuring out that crypto is like the perfect target. And according to like a US state report, half of their ballistic missile program is funded through stolen crypto. And in the last 5 years, they've taken $3 billion worth of crypto into the military program of North Korea, which takes up like a quarter of their GDP. It's like massive. And I guess from a weak signal perspective, I mean, we can chat if we want about crypto. I'm not that interested in that side, although we could chat about it. But the idea of like a pirate state that kind of actually has territorial borders and is stuck in one location just seems kind of strange to me, because typically pirate states or pirate communities or pirate organizations tend to be on the move. They're known to be on the move. You can't kind of locate them. They retreat into the mountains, or they retreat into dense brush, or they retreat into the marshes where they're inaccessible. But this is kind of strange. It's kind of this weird border, a territory that fully has to be defended with the military, that is also like a pirate state pulling money in from around the world. So yeah, I don't know if it's a weak signal or what it is, but I found it interesting.
Yeah. I mean, if the first thing I'm like, okay, yeah, there's like books, like I think there's a book, The Misfit Economy. It's well documented that it's sort of like outsiders, misfits, pirates tend to be where a lot of the harder imagination is happening. A lot of the ingenuity kind of happens. It's like there's the desperation for resources, like find a way. It is an interesting one because I wouldn't have bet that this was going to happen. I wouldn't have expected it, or that they would land on this gold mine, as you put it, right now. Yeah, what are those first impressions?
I find it interesting that some of these states that are making big bets on crypto, like the one that jumps to mind for me would be like El Salvador. Like I know Bukele has made massive investments into Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, which I don't know exactly how that has panned out for him, at least in the short term. I think he was making major investments just before the crypto winter. So that may be a little bit on hold for El Salvador. But there were plans for sort of a city powered by geothermal energy and all kinds of, I guess, moonshot efforts. And if I rewound the clock 10 years, I probably wouldn't have been able to anticipate that it was in places like El Salvador or North Korea where some of the early adopters of, I guess, crypto on a mass scale that you would find them. Although there is this kind of like libertarian bent as well to some of these enterprises, and obviously the seasteading folks and the charter city folks are also very enamored of cryptocurrency as an exit from the mainstream, or from fiat currency, or from the state. So maybe it all hangs together in a fun way. I do know that there are lots of charter city initiatives in places where you might not expect them. So
do we know, others, how North Korea stumbled upon this target or the techniques that they're using? Or do we know how this was reported on? How do we even know that this is what happened? Are they bragging about it at this point, that they stole $3 billion worth of crypto? Or
Well, of course not. Although I am curious. So there was like a hack last year, I think. It was one of these NFT things, digital pets, something like that, and they took
Hmm.
600 million out of people's ether. And they did it through a kind of social engineering thing slash script that they ran on somebody's computer. They like messaged somebody over LinkedIn with a job offer, sent him like a description of the job. That description had a little script in it, gave them access to part of the computer, and then they were able to like whatever gain access to all of the accounts that were hosted on this NFT place. And I'm curious. So they got 600 million. I wonder what the celebrations were like that night that happened. Because like on the scale of things, like when else is so much money been located in like one location? Like what? Like when you had to like steal gold in the past. I mean, gold is very heavy, right? Like very
Right.
difficult to move. This was not Bitcoin, so this is different. But Bitcoin is literally just an address. Like how many keys long? Like that's all it is. And
Hmm.
it can contain, I mean, there's no limit to what it can contain, right?
Yeah.
Maybe paradoxically, it's so centralized, like in a
Yeah.
different sense of what the term centralized means. So I think it's just because it's like stored, like it's just, my God, like how is that not the perfect target?
You asked what the celebrations that night would have been like. I suspect that they involved flying Dennis Rodman in on a private jet, at the very least.
Yeah, at the
Yeah.
very least.
The techniques then are still pretty primitive, right? In terms of that are being employed, like of
No, it's like moved up. Like this gets reported on through different state agencies because, like,
right.
I don't know, like states and hackers are very actually close together. So you learn about it through what they say is happening, and make your own decisions around how much you believe it or not. But they're saying it's quite advanced, and there's like stuff that's never been tried before. There was like a thing called like a supply chain cascade attack, which had never happened before, which was like basically it took like 3 or 4 steps of like different companies' software being infected, updates going out, and then those updates being used on the next person, next person, next person, next person, until eventually they could get access to like different clients. So a kind of cascade attack, which people were saying had never been seen before.
So
So
it's like
yeah,
significant in this way that like this represents North Korea is now like a presence that's capable in terms of a state that can hack and participate in cyber warfare at a different level than that no one ever previously took them that seriously.
yeah.
And so where does that lead, do you think?
I don't have the background to comment on North Korea. Like I really don't. I really have no idea what it means for North Korea.
Suppose you're writing a little short piece of fiction. What happens next? What does the world look like on the other side of?
I mean, the idea of like defecting and breaking off from the state that trained you doesn't seem that far off the cone of plausibility. And so, in the same way that like these different, I don't know, you've seen the rise of different mercenary armies in the last like 20, 30 years.
Hmm.
Possibly also the reversal of that, but who knows? I mean, I could picture something like that happening.
Like stateless actor army that has to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
Or lone North Korean hackers for hire?
Yeah, I wonder. I have no idea if they are they going to train other states that they're allied with? Like, I don't even know how many alliances they have. I assume it's not very many. They certainly have some people that they're close to. Are they going to do like knowledge transfer, stuff like that?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, my sort of unlikely sounding future would be a situation where the US as a client engages
Yeah.
North Korea for white hat hacking to identify different cyber vulnerabilities in systems.
I find myself curious about how these individuals are trained, like what that looks like within North Korea. And it also, I think there's an interesting asymmetry, right? Because if you have these sort of elite hackers who are part of the vanguard of, novel attacks and finding new attack surfaces and all this kind of stuff, and they are acting on behalf of a state that itself maybe, and I'm making some assumptions about North Korea, doesn't have as many digital attack surfaces within its own infrastructure, right? So relative to the states in which it might be engaging in cyber warfare, it has a more primitive infrastructure, wrong word there, but that kind of creates an interesting dynamic between North Korea and its adversaries.
Because no one has a PC in Korea.
Yeah.
It's just less
So what's the tit for tat, right? Like how would you combat that?
There was that book that was a science fiction novel, like written by some war studies type person or war consultant or whatever. I don't really know what their title is, to the US military, which was like, I think it was in 2010, Ghost Fleet. And the premise was that because attack surfaces are inevitable in any digital system, that actually military equipment would revert in the future back to analog systems because there was just no possible way. It's just by nature, you cannot plug up the vulnerabilities.
And that must be happening. Like that must be seriously being talked about. I'm trying to think if there's any like historical analogs to something like this. You might know about it. When a nation surprisingly gains some sort of capability, technological capability.
Oh, they all do. And they all use it in piracy. Like Britain did it against the Spanish fleet. They let Francis Drake, who was a pirate, they gave him blessing, actually. Or they kind of were just like, we're going to turn our blind eye, like go attack the Spanish gold coming back from Brazil and South America and whatever, take it. Like it just helps us. And then he eventually, I think, became a part of the fleet, like officially at some point, but he was a pirate for decades. And the US stole all its IP from Britain in the like late 1800s before it was able to develop internally all of its capacities and stuff like that. IP books. Britain would complain all the time about IP being violated.
I'm just reading a history of the US space program, and it goes way back. So it's not even like, it starts with Kennedy's boyhood, it's like one of the, so it's good, it's cool. It's like gives you a sense of where, I guess to a certain degree, his motivation and energy comes from in order to be the charismatic front man for the space program, to be like, this is what we're going to do. But in that history, it's pretty well known, but it's like, that's the US and the Russians were racing to get to the facilities where the V2s were being, built. And according to this history, like von Braun and his cronies, they were like, no, we want to go we want to make sure that we get captured by the Americans. So he dispatched one of his, colleagues to go make contact with the Americans who were approaching. So send him out to say like, hey, we're over here. We got as much as we can. Please don't let us go to the Russians. Of course, we're more scared of them than we are of you. And so that formed the core of the U.S. space program, and as well as ICBM. So it's not just the space program. Matter of fact, it probably so yeah. In the history, it's like no. They just wanted to be able to build missiles, and von Braun, his vision, his dream was space exploration more generally. He was willing to sacrifice. I guess I don't know, for him probably wasn't a sacrifice, but it's like, if it means I got to build missiles in order to get there, I'll get there. He had his eye on the prize, according to this history.
And using like horrifying slave labor and stuff
Terrible
to get there.
Terrible.
Right?
10,000 people, they say, died, with doing these very dangerous and chemicals and all this kind of stuff. Terrible.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a note to end on, and the signal on. It's just the horrors of the mid-20th century. I mean,
so signal or noise on this one, Jayar?
It has to be signal. Again, just because, as Valdis observed earlier, the world is an increasingly interconnected set of attack surfaces for these types of interventions, these types of acts. And that to me seems like a state seizing on some kind of an advantage, like we were just sort of talking about, some kind of an advantage that might become their strategy moving forward. I mean, I think being a nuclear state is obviously meaningful, deeply meaningful, but the butt of the world's joke a little bit. There's always this sort of like ramping up of hostilities and rhetoric, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then maybe they win a couple of concessions or a couple of hands get shaken, and then it all kind of goes away, and all it really does is perpetuate the Kim regime. It gives them a bit more gusto. It gives them a bit more wind in their sails. But it sounds like this is a viable path forward for a state that finds itself in the situation that they do to, I don't know, be cash positive.
Right.
So I have to say signal.
Yeah, I mean, 3 billion is
not nothing.
That's not a joke. Julian, is it signal or noise?
I think it's definitely signal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just because it's there's a lot to evolve and develop. It's signal because I think it's evocative to, or it's possible to tell a story about how that signal gets amplified in some ways and
Right.
becomes a condition. And you have to imagine, if not because of the scale, like 3 billion, you know, as they say in billions, 3 stacks, like they just kind of like, you know, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a lot to us. To some analyst, you know, at some state agency, it's probably like, it's not the money, it's that they were able to do it.
Right.
You know, like we're the U.S. government. We lose $3 billion every 4 minutes. Don't even know where it went. Don't even know.
Right.
So it's not that. It's more like, oh, yeah, this is a problem. You can see someone writing, someone at Rand or whatever the equivalent of nowadays, like writing up the report, like, and hoping it gets the right eyes on it.
Right.
I felt the same way with the 3 billion number, and I just Googled it for curiosity. North Korea's like total GDP is 18. So that's a way higher ratio than I would have
That's what I
anticipated.
was thinking, is that like the loss of 3 billion might not be the big deal, but the gain of 3 billion might be significant for North Korea in terms of what they can do.
Yeah, that's just GDP. That's not like their exports or whatever, which would be what they like money flowing in, their net inflows, which is probably a lot smaller.
Yeah, I mean, signal, I'm curious where it goes in sort of the worlds we're in. Is it like the next strategic innovation case study book at the airport bookstore is the North Korean hacker manual or something? I don't know.
There was a great article in Toronto Life, of all places, a few years ago. There was this like guy in Toronto who was a big importer exporter of narcotics, and I guess he was interviewed for it. He might have been in prison and stuff, but he was like, "Oh man, it's all about supply chain innovation and customer experience." It's like fully, he just had all the lingo of.
He read the book.
business.
Yeah. How do you?
Yeah.
I interviewed Freeway Ricky Ross once, who was famously peddling drugs for the CIA in the midst of the Iran-Contra scandal, and he was talking that way as well. So it wasn't for Toronto Life. Anyway, Julian, what's your weakest signal?
Yeah, so I'm going to say there's a signal that I felt. It came in on my receiver. It's been coming in for a few years. I debated whether I should offer this as my signal, but I think it's an important one. And the signal was, it just came, it was one node, so it was me. So it wasn't like a wide broadcast thing, but it was the pandemic and there wasn't a lot of contact with other people. But so when people, basically asked to be let into the Near Future Laboratory Discord, it's open, but you need an invite link. And I made it so that people had to, basically they just had to get up the courage and nerve or whatever it is to basically send me a note or whatever, which isn't a big deal. I'm one of the easier to find Julian Bleeckers on the internet. So people would send a note and I'd be like, yeah, great, here's a link. The only thing I ask is that you introduce yourself in the Introduce Yourself channel. And then that way I'll, adjust my roles, so we're making sure that you're not a robot and that kind of thing. And when you do that, I'm going to send you another link for us to grab a coffee, a virtual coffee. So everyone who joins, I end up having I say it says 20 minutes in the invite, but it ends up going for like 45, an hour. And there was a common theme to the conversations. And it was something that if it wasn't expressed directly, I felt. And that feeling was a sense of, they're mostly, because you'd say, generally like highly creative individuals in the broadest sense. Art, technologists, designers, engineers, they make things. They're people who like to have an idea and try to figure out how do they articulate that idea, how do they make it. And the common thing that I felt was a sense of like I don't know, it was like almost like ennui or angst. And I don't think it was just the pandemic. I know it wasn't just the pandemic. It was a sense of that they had imagined, when they were a kid, that they wanted to do something responsible and creative. And they thought that that is a way to contribute to making the world a little bit more beautiful, making the world a little bit more fun, making the world a little bit brighter, making the world a little bit more playful, like those kind of feelings. And there was this signal I was getting. It's like, I thought I was going to be doing something different from what I'm doing, or what I'm doing doesn't feel like it's doing it. And I sort of categorized this into the realm of, I guess, without like indicting any industry, it's like, I thought tech was going to make the world a better place. And I'm in tech now, and I don't think it's doing that. I'm being told that it's not doing it, and I'm feeling that it's not doing it. This was an era where it was even before the pandemic was kind of like, I don't know if this is really working. We had visions of, if we connect everyone, the world's going to be a better place. And if we connect them in a beautiful way, things will become more habitable. It'd be like everyone's a neighbor. It'd be great. And that wasn't happening. And so the signal that I was feeling was this sense of confusion, and almost like my vision for how my life was going to be is now not quite right. And I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah, I love this as a signal. I love signals that come from feelings and I think that also just comes from, I love the way that you carry out a metaphor until it falls apart. I think there's always lots to be learned from doing that with language. But yeah, there's many ways to think about this. The first thing that came up for me was just like, to rephrase maybe, is like, creative work is not all it's cracked up to be. Creative work is not doing what it promises. And it made me think of the many industrial designers turned people who do what we do, like turned foresight strategists. And I feel like I come across those a lot because they get into ID thinking they're going to get to design snowboards or like Braun products or Apple products or whatever, PlayStation controllers or, whatever it might be. And so it ends up being like, can you pretty much rip off this hairdryer that we already?
Yeah. Could you make our toothbrush look like it's a little bit faster?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they find it really uninspired. And so it's like the design, what they know about design ends up getting applied to a more cognitive type of task, and they go into strategy, but then maybe that type of work doesn't live up to it either, or the same kind of dissatisfaction takes over. I'm not sure.
Are there differences in where people are located or the industries that they're part of or anything like that?
I would have to assume that there is, and there is so I didn't, it wasn't 10,000 people. I think I've done maybe 500 or 600 of these calls over the last few years. And oftentimes just because of where New Future Laboratory, or I guess, where my attention gets situated to kind of, that people kind of naturally get drawn in, it ends up being kind of big tech in one form or another, or also people who are studying currently, they haven't got their degree yet and they're trying to figure things out. So, they're sort of generally well-educated, thoughtful enough to be able to articulate what they're feeling, and reflective enough. And then also, the other barrier is what is Near Future Laboratory? It's just it's not the biggest organization in the world that you kind of reach out to. So there's a little bit of self-selection in that sense. But it is kind of more technology oriented, or at least technology adjacent, like people who are HCI, human computer interaction kinds of folks, or UX folks, or art technology sorts of folks.
Maybe it was a leading question because I was like, I wonder if it's like a change in what was kind of clunkily called the California ideology, which I don't think is a perfect term, because I just think there's more variation in what people were inspired by from the 70s onward. But I wondered if it was if that's what part of what the signal was getting at, or if it was just a broader kind of malaise, COVID induced, reflecting on, what the purpose of what we're doing is and stuff like that. Because lots of industries went through hell during COVID.
Yeah, I think
particularly healthcare. Yeah,
I think it's probably a part of it. I mean, I like the way you're kind of framing it. I think there was a component that if there was a useful side of the pandemic, it was we were all in a sensory deprivation chamber for a couple of years and forced to reflect. And if your psyche is well regulated, I guess you use that with a sense of purpose. Okay, I'm just going to really assess what's important to me. And if you're dysregulated, I guess you kind of screamed and yelled at people or something. Got angry because someone wasn't wearing a mask.
I agree with Rob. I think there's so many ways to think about this. And Julian, I would echo what you're saying in a lot of the conversations I had, especially have had with people who are, maybe they're starting out, they're trying to find a foothold in a creative industry. They at least here in Canada, and to some extent also in the US, there's just life is becoming very unaffordable, and people really feel as though they're either treading water or slipping below it. And so there's some of that. I also think that there's just such an enormous gap between the expectations that we have for ourselves and in this world where we're, encouraged to, I don't know, follow our dreams, and there's this sense of self-regard, and that the real world doesn't match some of those expectations, and sometimes, what we're called on to do seems very prosaic and so on. So I wonder if it's just the widening gap between expectations and reality. I grew up in the 90s, which I kind of feel like that was almost like at least as a young person in Canada, it felt like a break from history. Like there was just this it was breakfast cereals and Saturday morning cartoons, intramural, like after school sports.
Hell yeah. Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. And it just felt like, there was the life was just this sort of expansive fun and, ease. And, maybe that's just a common, or not universal, but a common experience of childhood. But I think especially for, this sort of, let's say, cohort of roughly millennials and perhaps, Gen Z as well, there's just such a jarring transition from adolescence and young adulthood into this morass of, platform capitalism, where we all get on Zoom calls with 30 other people and do daily stand-ups where nothing really happens. And, you're a, assistant producer, or you're a background artist and you specialize in rock textures or something like that. It just there's a precipitous gap between where you thought you'd be and where you end up, at least initially.
Yeah, I think there's also the historical context is useful to consider, and it's just a sketch of a thing, and there's a lot of potentially holes in it. It also felt like I talked to a lot of friends and colleagues who we kind of came up professionally in an era where there was that sense of expansive possibility, and it was all around the time when it was kind of like, oh, word, you got a DSL line? It was like, so things were just starting to happen, and what did you do this weekend? I worked on my homepage. Wait, what's that? What's a homepage? Like when you started feeling like it was full of potential. And then my cartoon sketch of it's like, well, then someone figured out how to put a credit card in it. Mm-hmm. And then there was still that interesting potential because it's like, okay, cool. And then it kind of reified in this way that it became difficult. But there were all these beautiful things at that moment. And some of those beautiful things were like, I was reflecting with some friends, O'Reilly had a conference called eTech. It stood for Emerging Technology. Mm. And it was just a context in which a lot of they called them like sort of the alpha geeks would get together and present stuff they were working on. I mean, it was like, pretty well-produced event. And then, beautiful things would happen in the hallways, as you would expect in things like this, where it's like ideas are hatched, people just sitting on the floor, kind of like sketching things out and building and creating. I don't know how much of it was like, I'm building a unicorn, as wouldn't it be cool if we wired this to this? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be cool if we tried to find the way to, do these interconnects, and like amazing companies came out of it, like Flickr, before it got by Yahoo and stuff, came out of that. The precursors to Slack came out of that, but it was just like this sense of possibility. It was one of the first things I did internet related was start a cyber cafe in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. But you could do that, and it wasn't like, I don't know, you could just shoestring it.
So this idea like that you could do that. I think there's like a pace where things move really quickly, but just hearing about all that right now, something I've been following is just there's this booming like homebrew computer club style scene movement happening on Instagram and TikTok, that of people just making really creative hardware, kind of doing what you're saying, like what if we connect this to this, and it's like it's amazing stuff. It's very, to me, it should be very inspiring, but I think like a lot of those things, when you have so much access to so many people doing so much clever, cool DIY stuff, there is this weird tension with that and kind of chilling effect that happens where you actually leave looking through, 100 squares of awesome computer stuff, and you're just like, well, why would I even, there's nothing left to contribute, because it's all, every person doing it is there. There's no mystery of like, is somebody else in the next town doing this? Is somebody else on the other side of like, it's a little too rapid that you get in that, I think can be very, actually, it can have this sort of surprisingly uninspiring effect on people.
I can't remember the name of the book at this moment, but it's about this idea of a generalized peer, that social media has created this sense that there's not other people, but like this sort of or generalized personage who is we are always measuring ourselves against. And when we feel like I'm not doing enough or I'm not productive enough, we're typically not measuring ourselves against an individual, although sometimes we might do that and say, oh, this person in particular is a model for how I want to be more whatever. But what we're more often doing is just taking the aggregate of all the things that we see people doing on our social media feeds and wherever in media, and not realizing that, the person who's doing that incredible thing on TikTok, or who's doing this amazing thing or writing this incredible Substack, is also probably just vegging out that evening and has had a meal where they just completely turfed out and didn't follow a diet. And like, we don't see any of that, obviously. What we see is what they're willing to ship. And so it just feels like everybody's shipping all the time. And then if you feel like, well, I haven't really done anything in however long, I mean, I can see how it would have this effect where you're like, well, why would I bother? I mean, I just don't have the same gusto, the same commitment. I must just lack the commitment that other people have.
Yeah, the human psyche is a funny thing, isn't it? That you could go from seeing this beautiful stuff that energizes you in a way to, pulling a cork on a bottle of rosé and saying like, well, forget it.
So, and with the few hundred people you've been talking to, and where you have this general sense, do you feel like since then, most of them are remaining in this sort of listless state and are feeling this way? Or do you feel like many of them actually have they're just aware of this, but they overall have pretty healthy creative mindsets and have a compulsion to create, and they're going to regardless? What does it feel like is happening with those people?
Well, my hope is that many of them have found like a little bit, like a second home of sorts within the kind of slightly larger, it's not huge, slightly larger near future laboratory community. Just kind of like, okay. And when one of the things that I say to people in these calls, I was like, I just want to let you know that everyone else in here, it's a Discord right now, everyone else in here is exactly like you.
Right.
They're wondering the same things, they're feeling the same things. And so I think people have a sense of, okay, well, I found like a little bit of a home. This is cool. There's a little clubhouse,
Yeah.
I'll come here when I can and kind of luxuriate in the sense of community and the sense of, some kind of sense of family, in some way. So that's gratifying if they feel that. And to a certain degree, I think if you can get that kind of feeling, then it's a win. Like I'm not alone. I'm not alone in feeling this. Feeling this sense, because oftentimes the other ways of articulating or representing or translating that feeling can be not so good. You're angry at work. You're frustrated at work. You want to quit without really understanding why you want to do it. I went through all these things, by the way, over many years as a professional, and I didn't know what was going on. And so hopefully it gives them a sense of like hope and also maybe purpose that, okay, well, maybe things can change, or at least this was helpful to just understand that, I'm not the only one. I'm not feeling the same thing. And then there are people who they find incredible, I guess, relief or opportunity when they say to me, it's like, how do I get to do more of what you do? Like they're asking that in a very practical, pragmatic sense. They're saying, I actually want to do this for a job. How can I figure out how to do this stuff, which you guys do as well, as a job? I feel like I can contribute more value, and it'll be more satisfying to me if I can integrate some of these approaches, practices, mindsets, just vibe of this kind of future stuff in my work, because I see it's totally relevant. I'm not trying to say like I'm going to get a job, as a designer of some description or an engineer of some description within a company, and then say like, hey, you know what? I want you guys to pay me to play pickleball. It's not that. They
Right.
really feel like this is going to help what we do, and it's going to contribute value to the bottom line. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that from the perspective of, I'm not anti-capitalist. It's like, I believe you can do something of value, add value to something, and make it into something that's a little bit better, a little bit more beautiful, and then, get some of that value back in the form of like, oh, here's a paycheck at the end of the week. Cool.
Right. Yeah, there's a funny loop that happens too, where it's like you do all these projects, the passion projects, to get a job. You build the portfolio, you do that to get a job. Then you get the job and you do the job to do those passion projects on the side again.
That's a really good point, because there's a project that we're just now finishing up. All the projects right now in Near Future Laboratory, and maybe this entire year, have been 100% like organic. By that I mean no one commissioned the work.
Right.
We're just doing it. And one of them, it's a project called Green Pages, is the kind of internal code name or whatever. It's what does the future look like of, let's just say, Hollywood, if we represented it in the form of kind of trade magazine, like Variety magazine. If you went to the future and you picked up a copy of Variety magazine, what would it say in it?
Right.
What would be the feature article? What would be the story about what film was made and production and all that kind of stuff? So that project had been kind of sitting around for a while, and then one guy in the Discord named Thomas was like, "Hey, I'd love to run this project. Like, let's get this thing done." And he told me there were a couple of things going on for him. One was, I love the idea of doing a magazine from the future. That's just cool. Like, who wouldn't want to do that? And the other thing, and I can't remember if I offered this to him as something to think about, or if he just kind of thought, he's like, this is going to be the best portfolio piece. He's a graduate student right now. He's finishing up. It'll be way better than any project I did, where I paid the university for the to be able to be enrolled here to get a degree. He's like, this, because it's not going to be like a PDF. It's going to be like an actual, we're going to manufacture the magazine. And I think he was absolutely right. And I think that was the right way to go about it. For him and his position and what he's doing, it's like, I'm going to, his goal is, the last time I talked to him about it, is like, he wants to be an independent creative. So he wants to start a studio, which I think is amazing. And I think he'd be excellent at that. And he's going to, it'll be a tough go, as it is for everyone, but it'll be worth it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are forces at work, some of the ones that we've talked about, that will make this feeling that you're sensing from young people persist or get worse?
I think it's going to get better. I think for a variety of reasons. I think one is that when people like you and me talk more about it, I think then it becomes like, oh, okay, this is again, the thing of like, I'm not alone. And then when we do things like offer just a perspective or even a story about how it could be otherwise, in the context of kind of work. Let's just talk about work, or how do you make the pursuit that maybe where you commit the most amount of time and energy for your life, whatever you call that, let's call it work, a job. When people see that it can be otherwise, I think that offers more hope, because you start to see like, oh, okay, I'm talking to other people who managed to find a way through this. And I think the more we do that, the more the sense of hope and possibilities persist. And then I think there are other things that are a little bit, that can kind of operate on people, is reminding that there are these cycles. I don't know, like, so I mentioned the early internet days, so like the 90s and the mid and late 90s, and then there's a period where really cool things happen, like, oh my God, do you hear about this company named Google? Like, they're doing this really cool stuff, and it's fun and exciting. It's like they give you 20% time to work on your own independent project, that kind of thing. And then that energy kind of goes away, because structure gets introduced into the equation. It's not just fun and wacky, but it's like, now there's an employee manual, now there's a procurement department, now there's HR, and now actually the founders are kind of like, they're off doing something else. So that beautiful energy that started the whole thing is now called McKinsey. Not to, but it's just it's imposition of these structures that then evacuate that. And then you also kind of like, again, not to disparage like the creative energy that I know still exists within big organizations, but at some point it's less present. It's more distributed. It's like it kind of, because of the nature of it, it's like now there's 160,000 people. How many of them are really like kind of fun and cool and wacky? No. It's now the lawyers are there. But those cycles evolve.
How we all went through this together.
Yeah.
At an innovation firm that was acquired by a 200,000 person IT company.
Yeah. So. A good friend of mine, his company, like early on, Google was pretty huge at the time, but it was years ago. Bright, innovative, creative guy. His company got bought by Google, and he had basically had to sit in prison for a couple of years until that lockout period. And they did it to essentially crush the competition, literally.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to him about it a week or so ago, and I told him, I said, I remember when I came by, and I was like, oh man, this is gonna be totally exciting. We're gonna go, and we're gonna have and you must be like running things, and like cool things are happening. It's like, how are we gonna do the next cool thing? And I got there, and he said, okay, this is how it's gonna work. And I thought it was gonna be like, okay, we're gonna meet the VP of creative, and then we're gonna meet the SVP. And he's like, first we're gonna go over here, and we're gonna get sushi.
Right.
So the thing is, we worked it out is like he figured out how to optimize the best food and when to go there. But he was just basically, and then when he left, he made these T-shirts. It said, "Google is the crusher of dreams," and that kind of spelled it out in a way. And it doesn't have to be that way. So what I'm saying basically is like, okay, well, let's start that cycle again. Let's imagine harder and think about the ways in which we can create conditions for a new creative renaissance, a new evolution of where we can position and direct and guide and shepherd this capability we have to imagine the world otherwise. What do we want to do next? Like, let's not lament, let's rebuild. And it might have nothing to do with what we understand as like big tech. We're not going after this because we want to become a billionaire. We're going after this because we feel like we have a responsibility. Our creativity has a responsibility. And now it's being exploited and extracted, and we're living in someone else's dream about what success looks like. We're bowing at the feet of like Elon or Sundar or whoever is the tech leader, because we're like, well, that's an accomplishment, that's achievement. And I think we can get to a point where we say like, no, it isn't. We're punk now. We're punk rock.
Yeah.
We're just starting a thing because we feel it, and we're making noise because we feel it. And people might be like, oh, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you waste your time doing that? It's like, you just wait.
Yeah.
You're gonna see Dylan plugging in, going electric at a folk festival. Like, fucking hell, man. Yeah, change things.
I feel that. Jayar, signal and noise.
I mean, I guess I would say if from the perspective of one of these presumably like younger people, I want to say that given that the things are cyclical, and we might be in this moment where there's been consolidation and the stifling of creativity, but there are always pockets of interesting things happening. There's always people off doing their own things. And so to subsume yourself in that feeling of anomie or feeling stuck, I think that's noise. So from that perspective, I would say it's noise. Having had conversations with people just like Julian has, I would say, you just can't take that for the way that the world is. You want
I know what you
want
mean by that feeling of being
the feeling
noise
is the
or a
noise.
matter of expectations and things like that. I know what you mean. There's like a part of me is just like I know the feeling, and the antidote is keep going, and that's it. And it does change. Valdis, what do you think?
Well, we've always discussed how the signal noise thing doesn't make sense. So I'll say signal, because I think you can turn it into one. Just depending on what you want to do with it, right? A signal is kind of it's a pragmatic question of what you want to try to leverage this to do. And being the dad historian on this podcast, I was reminded of like Detroit in the late 19th century. Early 20th century, and it was a place that had this like very deep-rooted Midwestern producerist ideology, like own your own company, tinker with stuff, make things in your backyard, build it up. And it gave rise to the car industry. Like it was a huge thing. Detroit then got eviscerated in the 60s and 70s and just gutted through forces that were outside the control of like any individual producerist operator. right? And stuff got outsourced and stuff got shipped overseas and stuff got automated and all that stuff. And companies just got so big that they had to kind of, economies of scale that made it like competition impossible. Like there basically weren't very many new car companies after the 30s, if I'm remembering correctly, except like boutique stuff. And that parallel makes me think of whether or not there's like a signal today around something like that. Like, oh, are we kind of shifting into a phase of, well, we already were in a phase of consolidation and corporatization and stuff like that in the IT industry. But is it a kind of, are people going to trickle out into other places? Do we have to find like the new California or whatever if it's going to be geographically located like somewhere else, And San Francisco is going to be what Detroit was,
Right.
40, 50 years ago. Anyways, that's one speculation, which is like in some ways a dark one, but I always find the distinction dark and light kind of like doesn't make sense because it's like you want to understand the conditions behind why things are happening, right? And so if the lesson here is like, okay, we can't recreate the producerist thing the same way that it happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we got to go somewhere else and try to figure out how to do it. And do it collectively, do it collaboratively, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's a signal, and it's funny. I did the historical analog as well, although mine just goes back to sort of like post-recession. And if there was also this like feeling of not being able to get a career started in that moment, what was sort of also being born at that time was what I would just call from here, like the age of 20% time, which I characterize as like TED Talks, Fast Company, design thinking. There was like a sort of actually commercial creativity movement sort of happening there that had a distinct flavor and that was very inspiring at the time. And I think things like TED Talks feel very diluted by now and watered down and don't do the thing they did when I first became aware of this vast resource of talks at age 23 or 4 or whatever it was. And I think that a lot of people agree that brand, along with like the Fast Company brand and like these things have faded, and you kind of characterize what happened to 20% time, Julian. But maybe we are at a moment, and like you said, Valdis, like maybe it's going to happen in some other place, in some other flavor. So I could see that coming. So signal. Jayar, what's your weakest signal?
I have a bit of an evergreen topic, something that I'm sure that you've talked about on this podcast and that it comes up routinely. I want to shout out real quickly, like you mentioned Wired and how that brand is sort of feeling a little bit gray. So this is something I picked up in an outlet called Rest of the World. The super interesting tech stories, mostly from outside the North American context. But this story does kind of come out of the Silicon Valley set. So it was specifically about how Silicon Valley, like training data companies like Scale AI, are hiring humanities PhDs, so people with backgrounds in literature or degrees in poetry or philosophy, to create custom text. Or they're commissioning stories, they're commissioning poetry, they're commissioning these creative pieces of work to feed as training data to their clients, right? So Scale AI is commissioning this work, and then they're selling it to OpenAI to improve their algorithms' creative output. So I'm sure we've all, tried to get ChatGPT to write a piece of poetry, and it's fucking awful, right? I mean, it's the most insipid trash you could imagine. So there's this gap in the creative powers of these large language models that these data training companies are now trying to fill by hiring armies of of humanities grads. So I think that immediately is an interesting inversion, because maybe we're just in the stage of the development of this technology where we are its tutors, and that it becomes our tutor like some way down the road, right? Like you'll be telling your grandkids, I taught this algorithm how to do this, and now it's teaching you to do the same thing. So that I thought was quite interesting, and it's linked to this, whole set of signals that are all, I think, around the like specifically creative writing output of large language models. Like we're just now starting to consolidate some of the implications of having had access to this technology for, what is it, like maybe a year? Who knows how time passes anymore? But Amazon just put a cap on how many books that an author can self-publish in a given day. You can only publish 3 books a day on Amazon. Only 3. Seems very limiting. And the reason for that is that people have been obviously using large language models to generate vast amounts of text and pumping out books. And then the specifics of the deal haven't been disclosed yet, I don't think, but the Writers Guild of America did come to some kind of an agreement over the past 24 hours with the studios. And I think that the hang up was specifically about the language or the commitment that the studios would make to the use or to avoid the use of large language models for certain types of applications, and to avoid attributions, to give writing credits to non-human entities, let's say. So only a person can be considered a writer. There are these very interesting kind of like precepts that are making their way into these bargains, which feel a little bit like they're ripped from a Frank Herbert book. So again, there's like a lot of things kind of happening here. I know this is an evergreen topic, and it's also coming in a moment where, again, we're trying to consolidate all of the implications of this first wave of commercial large language models. And then it also seems like this very short AI winter that we had, where people were kind of done or had explored ChatGPT as much as they felt like they were getting value out of it in mid-journey. And then, now it looks like we're about to take another step into the evolution of these technologies, because yesterday, and I don't think it's live yet, but now ChatGPT has image recognition and audio parsing capabilities. So you can upload an image of your bike and say, like, my bike's not working, what's wrong with it? And then it'll like take a look at it and say, oh, well, there's an issue with your chain or whatever. So who knows what any of that means and who it's important for. We'll do this podcast again in a year and see where that all goes. But just wanted to highlight some of the things that have been happening recently in this creative writing and AI space in particular.
Did you use ChatGPT to write your spiel just now?
I used good old copy and paste. That did the old-fashioned way.
Are the people that they're hiring the humanities students? Are they? I'm guessing North American. Are they so-called untapped markets?
Yeah, there is an effort underway to recruit people who have expert knowledge or are native speakers in other languages, and hiring poets and writers with humanities backgrounds, including in Hindi and Japanese. Because as bad as you think the poetry that large language models render in English, when they have access to, the Gutenberg project and these other large databases of public domain writing, I mean, imagine how bad it could be in writing in Japanese or Hindi. So they are actively trying to close these gaps. And it seems, or it sounds as though that it's not terribly paid work either. I mean, there are these very menial jobs that go on in training, which are just kind of tagging certain elements that the model outputs and so on. But I think it says that these positions pay somewhere around $50 an hour if you're producing poetry for the model to gobble up. So I do wonder whether, at least in the short term, this is going to be a little bit of a cottage industry of people doing this on the side.
So interesting. I wonder if any one of these poems written for the model ever become like anthologized.
That's a good question. And what does it feel like to write? It's a commissioned piece of work, but nobody's ever going to read it, I guess.
Yeah, it's weird. And it's a weird assignment even to just be like, what we're trying to do is just an exemplary good poem, like. Yeah,
I wonder what the brief is too, like ChatGPT would like to know more about koans. So, produce 50 of them. I would love to see the brief.
I would 100% read this book. Like, it should be a book. I know they're going to be IP'd the bazoo or whatever. Like it's just not going to be possible to make a book with it. But I would totally read the poetry training data specifically made only for, these bards' eyes only or whatever,
I think it's an attempt to root around this issue of authors finding that when they prompt large language models to describe their work, that it can do it fluently, right? So I can't remember who it was who asked about a very minor character in a novel that he himself wrote, and he put the prompt into ChatGPT, and it was able to do a bunch of expositions on this very minor character that hadn't been discussed in any press or anything like that. And so the implication was that somehow or other his book had become grist for the mill without his knowing or consent, and so on. So I think in order to avoid those types of implications and to steer away from the legalities of that, it makes sense for these training data companies to just, again, commission piles of original work from people that they can get relatively on the cheap, right? In the grand scheme of things, to avoid those issues.
Yeah, here's a callback to the pirating thing, because wasn't there like some kind of a lawsuit that was based on like one of the models using Library Genesis, which is this huge pirated PDF collection, to train itself? Because that's like, I mean, there couldn't be a better selection mechanism for high quality work than Library Genesis, which is this bizarre distributed bunch of academics, putting up everything that they want to read. I mean, it's so much better than Reddit, which was like old ways of getting material.
Yeah, Usenet even before that. No one is doing the informal training, like the people who are training robots to distinguish between, this or that bottle. This was something that I know X was working on with their everyday robots thing. Just training robots to do menial tasks, help someone on and off the toilet, and there were low paid workers who were the ones who were sitting there pouring in a bunch of bolts into a trough that the robot then had to try to figure out how to sort. That was training, right? I guess what's the difference between that and training it with poetry? I know there's a difference. It's more provocation. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say like we're fetishizing the poet versus the task where you're kind of like, who cares about bolts? But someone is training the robots to distinguish bolts, and they're being paid, whatever, $50 an hour to do that by X or Google or Alphabet or whoever's paying them. Well, it's easy to imagine. I don't know if they did it, where it's like, hey, let's just get a bunch of poems. Like, hey, can anyone here minor in English when they were in engineering school? Can you write us up a couple of poems? Just see how the thing does, or give us your assessment. Is that a good poem or not? I can't tell. It rhymes. Signal.
I mean, to me, this connects right back to Julian's signal too. And the question is just, what is happening to the feeling of gratification that comes with, hey, I made an object that exists in the world, and are we losing that? Is that feeling becoming obsolete? Like, we can still make an object, but any expectation you might have had, or that sense of that feeling, even when you write an article that nobody was going to read, or you finish your thesis, or whatever cultural object thing you make, there always used to be this feeling of having made something. And you would really have to manage expectations to have the job of writing 50 poems for training this large language model and feel like, fuck yeah, I wrote 50 poems today. I did a good job and I made a thing in the world. You would really have to retrain your own model and expectations of what that feels like and what that's supposed to feel like.
That's what the model like. Are you training a model for like those weird like chatbots that pop up that annoy you on like every other site in 2010? Like, is that what you're training? Or are you training like a tool for, I don't know, some kind of creative explorative version? Like when I hear somebody saying, "Oh, we're going to train it to make poetry," I'm just like, well, you don't know what poetry is. Like that doesn't make sense. It's not a product. It's a process. It's like a way of engaging with the limits of language at any given moment. Like it's not a product. It's not like, I mean, you could train it to do whatever, like different like types of rhyming schemes and stuff like that. That's easy, but that's not what poetry is. I might even really enjoy making 50 poems for a bot if it's like a kind of interesting, more experimental. I don't really know what I'm picturing, but
No, I mean, fair. A lot of the dissatisfied artists that I know, it has everything to do with what their expectations are of how it's going to feel or what's going to happen when they're done. And the ones that are more satisfied are simply satisfied by the fact that they get to do it.
imagine the pleasure you get out of moving the machine, like moving the machine and getting it to feel in some way.
Which is what we do anyway for an artist. It's like I just want to make someone feel something, feel what I'm feeling. And
Right.
if I
Yeah,
can,
you want to get that model to shiver.
yeah.
Well, there's the answer to how you make that feel good, right? Is that you need to be working with a large language model that has an empathy chip or whatever it is that makes you shiver when you hear a good line of poetry.
Thanks, Dave. That was beautiful.
I do think, Valdis, there's something really, you kind of said that poetry is not a product. Yeah, there's something really interesting there because, if I write a prompt and I hit send and then it generates this seemingly wonderful piece in the style of like Byron or something like that. Like, because the only reason for that poem's being was I asked this thing, right, to a machine and it gave it to me at an inhuman rate out of what is Yudkowsky always say about large language models are just like floating points that nobody really understands, and it just kind of coalesces. Like, that's not how poetry comes to be. Maybe that's a tendentious thing to say at the neural level, but it does seem to reduce it to a bit of a parlor trick, maybe, in a way, where everything, the output, no matter what the input is, the output lacks that dimension to it. I don't know.
There's a good book. I forget what the title is. Or who the author is, unfortunately. I think they work at Concordia right now. But the claim that they made was that partly because there's a very strong engineering culture, obviously, inside of the tech world.
Mm-hmm.
And that frames problems in a particular way. And when you're dealing with like creative processes, sorry, I don't want to set like engineers and creatives apart. Like, I think there's a lot of creative activity that goes on in engineering. But if you accept this frame for a few seconds, the idea is that you frame it as a kind of like, oh, we want to get a creative outcome. We just want to get a creative product. And then this person, who I'm going to look up once I get a second away from speaking, says that actually it's like, it is much more process-based. What you want in a creative interaction, whether that's with like a bot or an image generating algorithm, is not that the bot can, when you click it, make the thing you're thinking of. It's that it kind of leads you into some direction. It leads you somewhere on your process of creating something. That's what you want it to do.
Yeah.
You don't want it to just make a product for you. Like, that's not the goal.
You want it to be a muse.
Yeah, you could call it a muse. Yeah.
Julian, you said signal already.
Yeah.
Valdis, signal and noise.
Julian doesn't get a chance to.
I had the sense that Julian was matter-of-factly, it's clearly a signal. But did you want to explain what it signals for you?
Well, I think I preceded my declaring it a signal with what I was sensing around it. I think it feels like there's going to be industries of various sorts that will be the not quite collaborators, but creative force of one description or another that evolves and develops whatever the AIs are kind of doing to us. It just felt like, yeah, of course.
Valdis?
That gave me time. It was Sophion Audrey. And the book has a foreword by Yoshua Bengio, which is interesting. One of the big AI dudes. What do I think it's a signal or noise? I mean, yeah, signal. Yeah, we can take it in so many directions. I think the idea of like making language only for machine eyes or models, whatever the non-anthropomorphized term is going to be, is like very interesting. Like, I actually find it exciting. Like, I want to make language only for a model. If I knew that's what I was doing, there's something pleasant about escaping from the bounds of your sort of like human centeredness or something like that, and you're trying to feel the machine and how it works and figure it out. I think it's interesting. Of course, like, there will be a lot of horrible jobs with it, but that's for different reasons. It's not the technology in itself.
There is something sublime about it. You're right. It reminds me of like you ever see those videos of people who are like play music for cows in a pasture, and like you're just standing at the edge of the fence and you're like playing saxophone, and the cows kind of wander over and they're very curious and they become fixated on you. It's just this sort of like communication across species boundaries that's happening, or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you say that, Valdis. Like, I start thinking of like how you could triangulate, and what is there a spider graph like that you could imagine where it's like, well, I'm going to write one poem that's just sonically really interesting, and another poem where the images are really potent, and and kind of keep playing with these different poems that satisfy just one criteria, and could that kind of triangulate a brilliant poem or something like that for such a machine?
I mean, typically you need a lot of training material. That's why I don't fully understand how much this works. I guess it's like fine tuning the ends or whatever, but I could picture you being given briefs, and part of the task is now how do you coordinate the collective production of poetry among 500 people, in an office for a day. Like, which sounds actually kind of like an interesting task.
Yeah. Well, it's like the briefs too. It's like it's not different than people who do like commercial music writing for soundtracks and
Yeah.
stuff. And like the brief comes in and it's like, we need Taylor, it needs to sound like this Taylor Swift song or this Bruno Mars song. And it's very specific. And it's like, you just have to make it sound different enough, but the same. But they only have to do, 3 for their client to pick through, as opposed to 50 to train the machine to do it, to do their job. Yeah.
You need 30,000 by the end of the week.
Yeah. Signal. Broadcast from later.